One sunny day, I was playing in the park with my friends when I heard someone calling for help. It was a little old lady named Mrs. Wilson. She had dropped her grocery bags, and fruits and vegetables were rolling all over the sidewalk. I knew I had to help. I ran over to Mrs. Wilson and said, "Don't worry, I'll help you pick up your groceries." She smiled and thanked me. Together, we gathered all the fruits and vegetables and put them back in her bags. Mrs. Wilson told me that she was going to make a delicious fruit salad for her grandson's birthday. She seemed really kind. As we walked back to her house, she told me stories about her grandson and how much he loved fruit salad. I listened carefully. When we reached her house, Mrs. Wilson invited me inside. She gave me a glass of cold lemonade, and we talked some more. She showed me a picture of her grandson, who had a big smile on his face. I could tell how much she loved him. But then Mrs. Wilson looked a little sad. She told me that she had hurt her leg and couldn't go to the store by herself. I felt sorry for her and wanted to help even more. I asked if there was anything else I could do. She said, "Well, dear, I was going to bake a cake for my grandson's birthday, but I don't have all the ingredients. Could you help me get them?" I nodded and said, "Of course, Mrs. Wilson. What do you need?" She gave me a list of ingredients, and I rushed to the store. I picked out flour, sugar, eggs, and all the things she needed for the cake. When I returned to her house, Mrs. Wilson was waiting with a big smile. She thanked me again and said, "You're a kind and helpful young friend." We started baking the cake together. Mrs. Wilson taught me how to mix the batter and decorate it with colorful icing and sprinkles. As the cake baked in the oven, we continued to chat and share stories. I learned a lot from her, and she seemed happy to have some company. When the cake was done and cooled, we carefully placed it in a box and tied a ribbon around it. It looked delicious and beautiful. I helped Mrs. Wilson carry the cake to her car, and she said she was going to surprise her grandson with it. I could tell he would be so happy. Before I left, Mrs. Wilson gave me a big hug and said, "Thank you for being my little helper today. You've made a difference in my life." I smiled and said, "You're welcome, Mrs. Wilson. I'm glad I could help." From that day on, I visited Mrs. Wilson regularly. We became good friends, and I enjoyed hearing her stories and helping her with chores. I even met her grandson, who was as kind and friendly as she had described. We played games and had fun together. Helping Mrs. Wilson taught me that a small act of kindness can make a big difference in someone's life. It also showed me the joy of making new friends and helping those in need. And that's the story of the time I helped someone in need, and it turned into a wonderful friendship that made both of our lives better.